But the morning sessions are simply called Who Will Follow Jesus? And they are specifically geared to looking at those who follow Jesus most closely. And that, of course, was the 12 apostles. And so, what I'd like to do this morning is just do an overview of the 12 apostles by looking at the 4 times that they are listed in the New Testament. So 4 times it's said where Jesus called them one by one. And of course, that's Matthew, Mark, Luke, and Acts. Got you, didn't it? Okay. That was a cheap shot. But I enjoyed it. Let's go first to Matthew chapter 10 is the first time the 12 are listed. Matthew chapter 10. So Jesus knew that his earthly ministry was going to come to an abrupt end. Just 3.5 years that he would be on the earth. And so he spent quite a bit of time preparing these 12 to carry on the work after his death and ascension back to the Father following his resurrection. And so he chose 12. Now, he had many disciples who were following him, but he chose 12 for a very specific purpose. Now, if I were going to ask you this morning for the textbook Bible class definition of an apostle, what would you say? An apostle, how do we usually define that? We say it's one sent. Yeah. Now, that's not a penny, Miles. You don't mean 1 cent. We mean one who's been sent, particularly on a mission. And the scriptures use that word for others outside of the 12. Can you think of others in the New Testament who are called apostles who were not among the original 12? Yes, ma'am. Paul. In fact, have you ever noticed that when we refer to Paul, usually we say the whole thing, the Apostle Paul? I guess the guy who had to spend so much time defending his apostleship, and so we still refer to him as the Apostle Paul. Good. Who else is called an apostle? Barnabas is called an apostle. Remember, he and Saul were sent out on that first missionary journey. Who else? Who else is an apostle? When you think of one sent, even Jesus in Hebrews is called our great apostle. He was sent by the Father on a mission. And so we're going to limit our class this morning just on these original 12. And I wouldn't ever want to give the impression that by studying the apostles that I'm suggesting we're going to imitate them in everything that they did. What are some things that Jesus gave the apostles to do that has not been specifically given to us as his disciples today? Yes, sir. The ability to work miracles. Right. The apostles were given that authority. Good. What else? What else was limited to the apostles? All right. Yeah. So the ability to speak in tongues or the spiritual gifts that were given. Yes, sir. All right. That's an important one. Only the apostles could lay hands on someone and impart gifts to them. So when the apostles died, then that ability ceased. That would become important when you talk about spiritual gifts or miracles today. Good. Somebody else had one in this section here. Somebody stole your answer. Oh, yes, ma'am.
They didn't always have to serve
All right. So our sister says they were not given a always given a sermon outline, but Jesus said the Spirit will tell you what to say when you're brought before these judges and kings. So the Spirit would guide them into all truth. And that's an important consideration. We're not given that promise that he'll give us the words to say. We're going to have to study and read the words that have been revealed by the Holy Spirit. So yes, there are things that only the apostles could do, but still by studying the 12, we can be better followers and disciples of Jesus in our day. So I want to let you know, anybody who asks a question or makes a comment, I'm going to repeat it just for the benefit of those who might not hear them, as well as the millions watching by live stream. So we want to make sure they're included. All right, so Matthew chapter 10, with that framework in mind, let's read verse 1. And having summoned his 12 disciples, he gave them authority over unclean spirits to cast them out and to heal every kind of disease and every kind of sickness. Now the names of the 12 apostles are these: the first, Simon, who is called Peter, and Andrew his brother, James the son of Zebedee, and John his brother, Philip and Bartholomew, Thomas and Matthew the tax gatherer, James the son of Alphaeus and Thaddeus, Simon the zealot, and Judas Iscariot, the one who betrayed him. These 12, Jesus did what? Sent out. See, there's our apostolic definition. Well, what word does Matthew use in verse 1 to describe these 12? He calls them the 12 what? Disciples. And you said, well, I thought we were studying the 12 apostles. Well, let's talk about that. What would be our textbook definition for a disciple? How would we define disciple? A follower, a student. See the connection to pupil and disciple? Or sometimes we'll say a learner. And so we need to understand it wasn't that Jesus was walking down the street and said, oh, let's see, I need 12 apostles. Let's just start picking people at random. These were the men he had already said, come and follow me, come and learn of me. And so they came and learned, and then they were sent out to preach. You see that? Sometimes we start at the wrong place in evangelism. We say we need to be everybody out preaching the word. We need to all be out there preaching the gospel. Well, what we need to do first is come and learn, or else how are we going to know what to say? And that same pattern then is repeated in the church. When the day of Pentecost came and those 3,000 were baptized, what did they devote themselves to? The apostles' what? Teaching or doctrine. So now the apostles are the ones teaching, and then the apostles will send out. So these 12 that were apostles were first disciples of Jesus. They came and learned of him. And of the 4 lists, now there are subtle variations. The order of the names is different, but there's always one that is first. And who do you think that is? Matthew even uses the word the first, Simon, who is called Peter. That's the Greek word protos, like prototype. And it doesn't necessarily imply that Peter was some official leader or spokesman of the group. But have you ever noticed how many times when Jesus would ask a question that Peter would speak first? I mean, even at the Transfiguration, when Peter, James, and John were overwhelmed and it said they didn't know what to say, well, that still didn't stop Peter. His motto was, "When in doubt, speak." You ever know anybody like that? But of all the dialogue that's revealed from Jesus' time with the apostles, there's more revealed about what Jesus said to Peter, and there's more revealed about what Peter said to Jesus than any of the other apostles. And so when we think of the apostles, we probably think first of Peter. In Matthew's list, one subtle difference with Matthew in the other three lists, he's simply listed as Matthew, but in verse 3, this time he is listed as Matthew, the tax gatherer. So his occupation is listed only in the book that he wrote. Why would that have been something that to the first century reader, they would have thought, a tax collector? Jesus chose a tax collector to be one of his apostles? Why would that have been such a big deal in the first century world? Yes, sir. Okay, he says tax collectors were typically dishonest, so they collected legitimate taxes for Rome, but then they charged their own tolls for their own benefit, which is why John the Baptist, when those tax collectors came to be baptized, he told them, go and collect only what you're supposed to collect. So very good. They were dishonest. What else about the tax collectors? Yes, ma'am. Very good. She said they were Jewish people who worked for the Roman government. So the very power that was oppressing God's people, they were not only employed by them, but benefiting from them. That's excellent. Was there a hand somewhere here? And so who do we usually see tax collectors grouped with in the New Testament? What kind of sinners, prostitutes, other tax collectors, Gentiles? Yet when Jesus chose them one by one, he chose Matthew. Keep your place here, but look at Luke chapter 5. This is Luke's record of Jesus calling Matthew, and he uses his Jewish name, Levi. Matthew 5, verse 27. And after that, he went out and noticed a tax gatherer named Levi sitting in the tax office. And he said to him, follow me. And he left everything behind and rose and began following him. Don't you love that? He left everything behind. Peter, Andrew, James, and John, what was their profession? What were they by trade? Fishermen. So Jesus called them and they left the boat and their father. But if this apostleship thing doesn't work out, we can always go back to fishing. There's always other fish in the sea. But I want you to be impressed that when Matthew left everything behind, he could not go back. He was all in. Because if you think a tax collector had a bad reputation, who's going to hire a former tax collector? That would be a Republican. And I mean, that would have been bad news in that day. There's also a description in Matthew's list. Ricky just got that. In verse 4, Simon, verse 4 of Matthew, back in Matthew 10, Simon the Zealot. And that's the way he's listed in all four lists of the apostles. Simon the Zealot. Now, partly that distinguishes him from Simon Peter. But why would the Zealot, why would that have also in the first century world been amazing to think that of 12 spots, Jesus gave one of those to a zealot? Who were the zealots? Where'd you say? Religious assassins. That's exactly right. They were part of a political party, one of those Jewish sects that formed during the period between the Old and New Testaments when they were trying to force Hellenism, the Greek culture, on the Jewish people. There was one party that said, we're going to be zealous for the law of our fathers and take it to the point that we'll carry weapons and assassinate Roman officials. It's thought that Barabbas was a zealot because remember, he had committed murder in the insurrection. And yet Jesus chose Simon the Zealot. He became a preacher of the gospel of peace. He would have targeted tax collectors for assassination. Don't you wonder when Jesus sent them out 2 by 2 if he didn't just put Matthew and Simon together? Go preach. This isn't about you. Go work it out. But here were 2 men who loved Jesus, and so they learned to love one another. Who will follow Jesus in this way? Leave it all behind and be united in our love for him. All right, any comments or questions on this very first list of the 12? All right, let's go to the list number 2. That's going to be in Mark's Gospel, chapter 3. Mark chapter 3. And what we're looking for here are just some variations or additional details that are given that we didn't find in Matthew. So we'll start reading at verse 13 of Mark 3. And he went up to the mountain and summoned those whom he himself wanted, and they came to him. And he appointed 12 that they might be with him and that he might send them out to preach. See that pattern again? Come and learn, go and preach. And to have authority to cast out the demons. And he appointed the 12, Simon, to whom he gave the name Peter, and James the son of Zebedee, and John the brother of James. To them he gave the name Boanerges, which means sons of thunder, and Andrew and Philip and Bartholomew and Matthew and Thomas, and James the son of Alphaeus and Thaddeus, and Simon the Zealot, and Judas Iscariot, who also betrayed him. Now, verse 13 tells us that Jesus summoned, and Mark says it this way, those whom he himself wanted. What do you think that implies about the 12? Now, here's an instance where we're interpreting a phrase, and so there's really no wrong answers here. These were those whom he himself wanted. What does that say to you about the 12? We got one back here. Yes, sir? Okay. That's very good. So he says, with these 12, if they can change, then they become a model that anyone can change. Nobody's unfit or unqualified to be a disciple of Jesus. Good. What else? Those whom he himself wanted. Yes, sir. All right. So our brother says that that points to the idea of God divinely choosing these men. They weren't chosen simply by man's qualifications or standards, but God himself did the choosing. He himself wanted them. So it was a divine appointment. Good. Somebody else? Yes, sir. All right, excellent point here. He said that just like with Matthew, who apparently was a tortured individual, he said they're looking for anyone who would see value in them and offer them an invitation to come. And remember that the rabbis, the teachers of Jesus' day had already made their choices for the Jewish boys they wanted as their disciples. These 12 had been passed over. That's why they're doing other things when Jesus called them. But Jesus, the master teacher, said, "No, these are the ones I want." It's kind of like after a presidential election in our country, in the period between the election and inauguration, he's setting up his cabinet, and all the speculation is about who he's going to choose for which post, and it'll be governor this or senator that or congressman this, all people who are already well known. Jesus didn't choose one Pharisee, Sadducee, Herodian, rabbi, scribe. He didn't choose any of those. That's not who he wanted. He chose these 12. Now, Simon and his new name that Jesus gave him, Peter, is again mentioned. But notice that James and John, the sons of Zebedee, Mark is unique in that he identifies this nickname that Jesus gave to them, Boanerges. That's the Aramaic, and Mark translates that for us. It means sons of thunder. Sounds like a wrestling team, doesn't it? Sons of thunder. And we're not told exactly why Jesus gave them that nickname. We have some suspicions, one of them being when Jesus was wanting to go through those Samaritan villages, and the Samaritans said, "No, can't pass through here." It was James and John that said, "Lord, do you want us to rain down fire from heaven and consume them and their villages?" Here, Jesus came to seek and save the lost, and James and John are saying, "Let's burn them to a crisp." See, they were off message. They still had some learning to do, not unlike Jesus' disciples today. Quick to judge, quick to condemn, quick to destroy. We forget of Jesus' mission. Those are the people he came to save. Those are the ones we're supposed to be serving. Look at verse 16 when it says that he appointed the 12. And that's how they're referred to a lot in the Gospels. Instead of listing all of their names, it'll just simply say the 12. And as you've already said, these were 12 different men, different walks of life, different experiences, different personalities. But I want you to be impressed that they came to be known as the 12. The 12. You know what that sounds to me like? The church. When people mention this congregation, they don't list out the church directory. They just say, the church. Why? Because Jesus has united us, and we're different, and we come from different experiences and different backgrounds, but we are his church, his disciple, and let us be known as his people. All right, comments or questions? We need to move on to the third list. That's going to be in Luke's Gospel, chapter 6. Luke chapter 6. And this time we start in verse 12. Luke 6 and verse 12. And it was at this time that he went off to the mountain to pray, and he spent the whole night in prayer to God. And when day came, he called his disciples to them and chose 12 of them, whom he also named as apostles: Simon, whom he also named Peter, and Andrew his brother, James and John, and Philip and Bartholomew, and Matthew and Thomas, James the son of Alphaeus, and Simon who's called the Zealot, Judas the son of James, and Judas Iscariot, who became a traitor. So the new information that Luke gives us is that before calling them one by one, what did Jesus spend the whole night in preceding this calling doing? Up on the mountain, spent the whole night in prayer to God. Now, again, the text does not identify for us. It doesn't say what Jesus prayed or how he prayed. But what are some ideas you might have of the things Jesus could have spent the whole night praying for or praying about? Who's got some ideas? What did Jesus pray for? Okay, without raising his hand, John said that what Jesus prayed for was strength for the apostles, for the task. He knew what they were going to have to endure as his apostles, and certainly not out of left field to think if he's going to call them one by one. Don't you think he prayed for them one by one? Great, John. Yes, sir. Okay. Yeah. So praying for himself and with patience for them for the times they're not going to understand and they don't get it, and they're slow of heart and understanding, and they seem to doubt and have no faith. And so Jesus could have prayed for the Father to give him wisdom and strength. Good. Yes, ma'am. All right. Very good. So they're going to be Jesus' eyewitnesses, she said. They'll be the ones who will be uh, preaching that they saw what they heard and the things he did. And so they're going to need in this great work God has called them to have courage and faith. Good. Yes, sir. Okay, boy, we're going right to the heart here. He said that they will be united. So we do know of one prayer in John 17. Sometimes we call it the high priestly prayer because Jesus is interceding on behalf of his disciples. And what do we know that Jesus did specifically pray for his apostles? That they may be one, that they may be united. And so I don't think it's out of character to surmise he's also praying for that here, that they may become the 12, as one as you and I are one to the Father. Now, also here in Luke's list, we have a problem. And the problem is in Luke's list, there's a name that we have not seen in Matthew or Mark. Now, it still adds up to 12, so that means that Luke has left somebody out. And so here comes the Bible critic. And they say, see, you can't trust the Bible. It can't even agree on the names of the 12 apostles. How can you believe anything the scriptures say? It can't even get that right. All right, so who has found the new name in this list? Who has found it? Yes, ma'am. Yeah, there's two Judases. If one wasn't bad enough, now we got two. Judas, the son of James. All right, so that's the new name. And which one do we not find in this list that we've seen in Matthew and Mark? Thaddeus. All right, so if we have this seeming contradiction, we have to try to find a way to explain this that's logical and plausible. And so what would you say is the most reasonable explanation as to Thaddeus being left out and Judas, the son of James, being added? They're the same person. Do we find other examples in the scriptures of one person going by different names? We've already seen, yes, Matthew and Levi, Simon, Peter. In fact, go forward. We're going this way anyway to Acts chapter 1. In Acts, the first chapter, when they replaced Judas, verse 23 of Acts 1, they put forward two men, Joseph, called Barsabbas, who was also called Justus, and Matthias. So the reason they chose Matthias is they didn't have a big enough name tag for the other. I mean, we call it Justus, Barsabbas, but what are we going to call this guy? Well, let's just do one name. Think about it. If your name was Judas in the first century, you think you might find a nickname? In fact, in John chapter 14, when John is writing about this same person, he calls him Judas, and then he puts in parentheses, not Iscariot. Thaddeus is a name that means warm-hearted, childlike heart. And so maybe he was the youngest, maybe he was the most tender of the 12, we don't know. But no contradiction. Must be one and the same person. Which then leads us to Luke's description when he says in verse 16, Judas Iscariot, who became a traitor. And Luke words it that way to remind us that Judas came on board and none of the apostles were suspicious of him. When Jesus identified, one of you will betray me, none of them at the table said, oh, I bet it's Judas, isn't it? I'd tell you, I've worried about him from the beginning, wanting to carry the money box. No, they were surprised by that. And Judas covered his tracks well. He hid himself well. And there's a dangerous lesson for disciples of Jesus today. If it can happen to Judas, it can happen to us. So be on guard. Somebody that close to Jesus can be led away. What about those who are 2,000 years removed? And then our final list in Acts 1, Acts, the first chapter, and verse 12. Then they returned to Jerusalem from the mount called Olivet, which is near Jerusalem, a Sabbath day's journey away. And when they had entered, they went up to the upper room where they were staying, that is, Peter and John and James and Andrew, Philip and Thomas, Bartholomew and Matthew, James the son of Alphaeus, Simon the Zealot, and Judas the son of James. These all with one mind were continually devoting themselves to prayer, along with the women and Mary the mother of Jesus, and with his brothers. So obviously this list is only 11. This is after the death of Judas. And it reveals to us that 12 was apparently not just an arbitrary number that Jesus chose, because they choose one to get the number back up to 12. And why do you think 12 was the number? What other significant 12 is there in the scriptures? Yes, ma'am. The 12 tribes of Israel, those 12 sons of Jacob who came to represent God's covenant with Israel. And so do you now see there's a new covenant, and these 12 are going to represent God going not just to one nation, but into all the world, that he will be their God, they will be his people. And did you notice that Jesus' prayer for unity has been answered in verse 14? These all with one mind were continuing in the temple. They fought among one another about which was the greatest, and they didn't understand, but now they're on point. Now they understand. Not our names that will be remembered, the name of Jesus that we preach. They didn't set out for there to be a St. Peter's Basilica or a St. Jude's Hospital or a St. Andrew's golf course. That was not their mission. They set out that people would know and become disciples of Jesus. So let us all, with one mind, continue the work that Jesus has given us, to seek and to save that which was lost, not to be served, but to serve him who gave his life a ransom for many. Come and learn, and then go and preach. We'll stop there. Thank you, folks, for your participation.